dedicated to this topic, to the spiritual autobiography from the Orthodox space in the 19th and the 20th century. And somehow this research is related with the thesis and is kind of a continuation of it, an outcome of the thesis. As an Orthodox, I found that most important Orthodox spiritual autobiographies are the one of Saint John of Kronstadt, Saint Silouane the Athonite, and Nicholas Berdiaev, who was written previously as a philosophical autobiography and then rewritten so that it became a spiritual autobiography. Now, I will use only two of the authors investigated in my PhD thesis, namely St. John of Kronstadt and Silouane the Athonite, in an attempt to answer the question, is spiritual autobiography a pastoral and catechetic tool? Of course, there will be also secondary questions that will be raised here. Now, starting with Father John of Kronstadt, we need to say that his spiritual autobiographies, in fact, his diaries, are very important for the Orthodox faith from different points of view. John of Kronstadt, a priest born in Arhangelsk in 1829 and died in 1909 in Kronstadt, was one of the most important spiritual personalities of Russia of all the times. And he's not only a personality for the Russian spirituality, but also for the universal spirituality. He wrote these diaries for different reasons. On one side, to receive this possibility of being humble, and in the other side, to explain what he was doing, because to be the priest who celebrated liturgy every day in those times and to confess more than 5,000 people every day with the blessing of the Holy Council of the Russian Orthodox Church was not something simple, and of course he was criticized. So in order to do this, he received the special blessing from the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, and somewhere close to the end of his life, he was also accepted exceptionally as a member of the Holy Council of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. As a part of the city life, he managed not only to be a good priest, but also to wake up the consciousness of the people from the complex and multifaceted industrial city that he was a priest of. Because Kronstadt, as you know, was a multifaceted and a very, very polychrome city at the time. There were here people working in different factories and exploited by the others. They were very rich people. There was a moment when it started, the socialism in Kronstadt, and there were kind of some revolts. They had these categories of bosniaks who were like kind of homeless in the time, but he managed somehow to bring all of them together and to do something for their life, both in this mystical and social life. That's the interesting part of St. John of Kronstadt, because like not many others, John of Kronstadt managed to bring together social life and spiritual one. So, for example, look how one of the bosniaks, this is a word that probably Dennis could explain better if he met before, because I didn't found a very clear translation of it. But one of these men who were bosniaks, one of those kind of like homeless or people who are like being poor and drinking a lot and having a lot of addictions and having a bad life, met for the first time. I quote, "I'm old now, but I remember the first time I saw Father John. I was 22 years old, married young, and had two small children. The oldest was 3 years old. What I worked for was spent for drinking. The family lived in poverty. My wife was secretly begging from neighbors. I lived in a dilapidated shack of the outskirts of town. One day I came home a little more sober and saw a priest sitting with my son in his arms. He was talking to him, and the child was listening. What could he be doing here? I was about to curse, but the benevolent looks of the father stopped me. I lowered my eyes in the shame, looked at me as if I wanted to penetrate my soul. The unknown father began to speak to me. He told me that my sheikh was heaven, and that where there were children, that was warmth and joy, and that his heaven should not be exchanged for the smoke of for the smoke. He didn't reprehend me. On the contrary, it was like it was tries to justify my behavior. So how Father John of Kronstadt managed to change his life by not criticizing him, by not condemning him, but by helping him to understand the real value of the life. So for this reason, I think it's important to follow his spiritual autobiography in order to find the pastoral tools that he used in his life that he sometimes describes. Not often, not every time, but sometimes he describes his spiritual life. Father John's activity is not limited only to the pulpit and celebration. He was invited in the educational and social life. As a professor, he had interesting experience of teaching, while as a man deeply interested in the social life of the society, he left a social project dedicated to the poor that is continued until nowadays. If you go to Kronstasdt, you will find the heritage of St. John of Kronstasdt. Now, speaking about his spiritual autobiography, among the aspects that define his life and have granted his posterity, his diaries must, of course, be mentioned. Written in Russian, they were shortly after translated into English and later into different languages, like the Romanian one. In Romania, we have all of them, all 8 of them translated, and also accompanied with different studies that come to speak about his impact and his role and his activity. Here, he describes his spiritual life, the daily life, and sometimes the relationship with others that are not always perfect. Sometimes he even used the diary for penitence. For example, when he presents the fact that he ate too much and he, for this reason, had troubles with his stomach. Writing about himself, Father John also shares his experience. In the same time, he provides advices for the readers, fact that transforms his notes in a useful catechetical and pastoral tools. With prophetic vision and beyond his times, Father John provides useful tools in the fight with the problems such as depression, for example. His approach is both spiritual and pragmatic, and he insists on aspects like being not prepared for death and to the need to move forward in cases of counseling depression. Reading his notes, one could be tempted to ask what made him to be such a loved author and his ideas so well received not only by his contemporaries but also by future generations. The answer is rather simple. The fact of being humble and natural. His diaries do not try to represent a demigod or a person with some extra skills, but a human with problems, doubts, and weakness. Therefore, with the occasion of the anniversary of the jubilee of 25 years of his priesthood, Father John addressed the priest that came to congratulate him with the following words: "Thank you for responding to my weakness with love and kindness. Of course, I'm full of weaknesses. I know my weaknesses, but the power of God in weaknesses is perfected. This wonderful power is perfected in me, and it has been perfected through my 25th years of priestly ministry. I dare to say, and it's truly my word, that through me is perfected in many sample believers in a visible, clear way the grace of God. May His grace be glorified." Of course, Father John is also a pedagogist who sent a message of hope and joy. That's why we use him here, and we consider his spiritual autobiography as a tool. Compared with his colleagues from the Cathedral of Kronstasdt, for example, he never used the priesthood as a tool of power, but rather as a modality to help people to rediscover the joy of love when lost. Among the topics that he approached in the spiritual notes, love and prayer are often referred. Speaking about what Father Dragos presented, love is also part of the speeches and of the notes of Father John of Kronstadt. He insists on the need for prayer and underlines the fact that it represents the most direct form of communication with God. In the same time, he realizes comparisons with realities that were contemporary to him in order to make people to understand in which state they are in relationship with this virtue. Of course, together with the unceasing prayers, the diary represents in his vision an important spiritual tool. Spiritual autobiography is not only a way of presenting his biography to the readers in present and future, but also a tool to monitor and improve his spiritual skills and to have an evidence of spiritual struggles and their result. In a dialogue with younger priests, St. John's often spoke about the need of a diary for the pastoral and spiritual life. Of course, the diary helped him to progress in his spiritual life and to be aware of the work of grace in his life. In fact, Father John used this as a method to avoid the prideness. Of course, it has also pastoral and catechetical relevance that we can see. Now, speaking about Father Silouane the Athonite, another author of the spiritual autobiography, we must say that in his spiritual notes, he speaks about his struggles, about the mercy of God, about love and grace. His diary can be considered a spiritual tool due to many elements of their content. It has both a pastoral and catechetic relevance due to its practical dimensions. Sometimes in its pages, the Athonite father praises the love of God that he considers as a landmark of the spiritual life. As we can see, there are a lot of notes dedicated to the love of God for him and in the same time to the way how he seeks for the grace of God. Like St. John of Kronstadt, for him prayer represents a very important tool in relationship with God and the development of spiritual skills. In love with the service of the church, he invites readers to discover these services and their beauty and to see beyond the form and ritual. In the same time, there is also another similitude of Father John of Kronstadt. He insists on the role of love that he presents not only as a virtue, but also as an element that connects people with God and an element that brings peace in one's soul and relationship with humility. I quote, "What must be done to have peace in the soul and body? For this you must love all people as yourself and be ready for that at every hour." When the soul remembers that, it reaches humility and surrenders itself completely to the will of God and desires to be at peace with everyone and to love all people. Being related with humility, love has a very important impact on the soul, and it brings to prayer, as Athonite Father underlines it. Moreover, he insists on the interdependency that exists between virtues and their practical relevance, compared with many other authors that rather led to be understood that the virtues are abstract notions. Of course, it was the time and the way how they were seeing this on the time. So, of course, spiritual notes of Saint Silouane were written by people who had poor scholarly preparation. In the same time, they are very, very deep and have a very, very deep theological contents. And the main topics are love, humility, and prayer, which are part of the spiritual life, and they are presented using contemporary catechetic tools. As I have mentioned, St. John of Kronstasdt and St. Silouane the Athonite spiritual autobiographies represent therefore useful tools in the pastoral and catechetic field, written on a calm and not institutional tone compared with other works on the theological field. They come to invite the reader to discover people that, despite of their sanctity, had weakness and worked to their improvement. At the same time, each of these spiritual autobiographies is an invitation to discover the self and to improve, to grow based on the work of futures in the life of the readers. Thank you very much.